So hi everyone, thanks again for coming. Just like everybody else, I know it's early on a Monday morning. Today I'm going to talk about coevolution on a very different scale than what we've heard about so far. I study fleshy fruits and how plants communicate with their animal dispersers. So this is going to be very kind of macroecological and macroevolutionary. So plants have this problem, which is they can't move. And that means that they need some other way to disperse their seeds around the landscape. Animals, of course, for the most part, are able to move around a bit, but plants don't have that. So plants need to take advantage of some other mechanism that will help them to move their seeds to a new place. Many plants do this by wind. So a lot of people are familiar with maples, but there's also kind of many other ways that plants can disperse in the wind. But many plants also rely on animals. And so up here, what I've shown are 3 different groups of plants that have fleshy-fruited clades within them on the top, and then relatively close relatives that are dry-fruited. So these plants produce a fleshy reward, and then the idea is that that reward attracts animals to the plant. The animal consumes the fruit, and then also consumes the seeds sort of as a byproduct of that, and then the animal can move away, defecate the seeds out, or regurgitate the seeds out elsewhere, and thereby the plant is able to move around. And this process looks like it's probably evolved multiple times in plants, probably many, many times. We actually don't know how many times. But again, these are just a couple of clades where you have both fleshy-fruited relatives and dry-fruited relatives that are pretty closely related. So an essential part of this is that plants need to attract animals to their displays, which means that they also need to communicate with animals about whether or not the fruits are ripe, and also just where the fruits are in the environment, because if an animal can't find the fruit, then the animal won't be able to eat the fruit and disperse the seed. So we all know this from going to the grocery store, but there are many, many fruit colors out there. There are like black, deep black fruits, there are bright red fruits, there are blue fruits, yellow fruits, there's shiny metallic fruits that are produced by structural color. So there's this huge diversity of fruit colors, but ostensibly they're all trying to serve the same function, namely attracting animals to the fruit and then convincing the animal that the fruit is going to be delicious and nutritious and all that kind of thing. And just like with fleshy-fruitedness itself and this whole process of co-evolving and having a mutualism with animals, these colors also have probably evolved many, many times, although again, we also don't know how many, we really have no idea how many times they've evolved. And so here, if you look at the major clades of angiosperms, you see that multiple fruit colors occur in all these clades, and very similar looking colors occur in all these clades. So it looks like there's not really much restriction in terms of which clades can evolve which colors. Some recent work has also tried to quantify what volume of color space these different clades occupy, and found that they all pretty much occupy the same volume of color space, which means again that these clades can all kind of evolve the same set of fruit colors. And when we look at this kind of on a large angiosperm context, here don't put any stock at all in these reconstructions. I just wanted to illustrate what happens when you try to map fruit color onto a large angiosperm tree. And what you see is that there's a huge amount of homoplasy. There's a huge amount of transitions back and forth from one color to another. It doesn't look like green can only occur in one part of the tree, or red is really only evolving in one part of the tree. Instead, what you see is this massive kind of transition back and forth that seems to kind of occur anywhere. And if we look at a particular, anyway, if we zoom in on one particular clade, you start to see that the same pattern's occurring there as well, where you have like red fruits, you have black fruits, you have yellow fruits, blue fruits, all occurring within a smaller clade. So there's a huge amount of homoplasy in this trait, which is interesting because it seems to, the classic idea is that it's related to attracting animals, and that there's been kind of coevolution between the perceptual abilities of different animal guilds and the actual fruit colors that the plants are displaying to try to attract them. So the traditional idea is that birds tend to be very visually oriented, so fruits that are targeting bird dispersers will have kind of a lot of visually obvious characteristics, such as being black or red or blue in color, contrasting with the background foliage, that kind of thing. But then the second kind of traditional syndrome is the kind of mammal syndrome, which I'm a little uncomfortable with because there's so much diversity in mammals, also in birds, but there's so much diversity that it's hard to call it all one syndrome. But that's what people often have done, and they say mammals are typically not as visually strong as birds are, and so fruits that are targeting mammals don't necessarily need to have bright colors, so they might be kind of dull colors like green or yellow or brown. So this is the kind of traditional idea. I'm not going to go into much more detail about it. I do want to say that it's a little bit controversial. There's some evidence that supports it. There's a lot of evidence that's kind of like, meh, it could be right, it could not be right, we don't really know. So this, however, I want to emphasize it because this is the idea about why we have so much fruit color diversity, is that it has to do with the animals that are eating the fruits and then selecting for different fruit colors. So fruit colors and seed dispersal and frugivory have been topics that people have been interested in for a very, very long time. But we actually don't know a lot of kind of very fundamental basic questions about these traits and about this mutualism. So we don't know things like, just how common is it, and how many times has endozoochory and reliance on animals as dispersers, how many times has this evolved, and like how many plants have it, or things about like what fruit colors are most common and how many times have they evolved. We do sort of know that black and red are probably the most common fruit colors, but we don't have a very good quantitative description of that, despite the fact that these colors are supposed to be very, very important for their role in this mutualism. And so I'm actually not going to talk about the counting type questions today. I'm going to talk much more about these spatial patterns. And so we also don't know some very fundamental things about the spatial patterns of these traits. There's been a little bit of work about the spatial distribution of fleshy fruits and dry fruits, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But there hasn't been much, and there hasn't been a great kind of global scale description of spatial distributions in animal dispersal. We also don't know kind of very like classic natural history questions about like, oh, are fruit colors more diverse in the tropics? People think that might be true in a lot of other groups, but and in flowers as well, so also in plants, but in different parts of the plant. And yet we just don't know about that for fruit colors. And we also don't really have a good description of how fruit colors vary across space. That's a lot of what I've been working on and am working on, so we're getting there, but we don't have a ton of information about these spatial patterns. So like I said, I'm mostly going to talk about spatial patterns and then how that relates to some evolutionary mechanisms that might be driving them. So I've been building this pretty large database with sites from around the world. I'm not going to talk much about it, but we do have a bunch of different traits in there, and we're starting to explore a bunch of different aspects of this database. But the goal is to look at how fruit traits are structured on a global scale and where all this diversity of fruit color comes from, when in theory it's supposed to be constrained by selection from two major guilds of animal dispersers. So the first big question is just how common is animal dispersal and where is it around the world? Some people, for a very long time, people have noted that the tropics often have a lot of fruits and a lot of fleshy fruits going on, but there hasn't been a great global description of this. There was a study in 2009 that had some discussion of latitudinal gradients in fleshy fruits, but it wasn't really focused exactly on this question. That was kind of a side question. And so what we're hoping to do is to start having a more global description of the distribution of fleshy fruits and whether or not that's correlated with different environmental variables. For instance, it's been found that more fleshy fruits occur in places with higher precipitation, so does that really work on a global scale? We don't know yet, that's the direction we're going. But for now, we also find a very strong latitudinal gradient with many, many more fleshy fruited species in the tropics, and a much higher proportion of the flora in the tropics relies on animals for dispersal. Oh, and I guess I should say that I've plotted up here the northern and southern hemispheres separately, and you can see that they pretty much show the exact same pattern, which is going to be very unusual for the rest of today. I'm not actually going to talk much about why the southern hemisphere is different, but it's really different in terms of fruit color, and I really want to think about that a lot more. Okay, so the second big question is, well, are fruit colors actually more diverse in the tropics than they are elsewhere? And people have thought for a long time, like our mental image of the tropics is often like a brightly colored toucan and like bees that are flying around and like iridescent beetles and things like that. So you might think that tropical areas are more colorful. That's kind of the impression that a lot of people have. But a paper from a couple years ago looked at birds and butterflies and flowers and actually found no signal of greater color diversity in the tropics. Which raises the question of like, what's happening in fruits? Is it like these other patterns where maybe the tropical areas are not as diverse relative to temperate as people have found, or maybe fruits are doing something different? So what we did was a very different approach to this. We took our sites and then looked at fruit color diversity in a kind of ecological way to try to quantify whether or not not just like what's the volume of space that's occupied by fruits and fruit colors, but rather is there also like different evenness levels occurring in different places. And you can see this really strongly if you see, hopefully you can see Nicaragua at the bottom has a lot of black and red fruits, but it also has a lot of other colors. Whereas if you look at Maine, which is on the right over here, you see that it's pretty much just black and red. And there's a couple of species that might have other colors, but it's largely just one or two colors. So when we analyze this in a kind of classic ecological framework, we see that the tropics have much higher diversity than high latitudes do. Interestingly, the southern hemisphere is kind of more tropical looking, which is also going to happen a lot today. But in the northern hemisphere, we have this very strong signature of tropical areas are much more diverse, and high latitudes are much less diverse. So the question is, like, what colors are actually driving this pattern? So when we start to plot the frequency of different colors across communities and latitudes, what we see is that red and yellow seem to show the strongest latitudinal gradients. And I'm not going to talk about yellow today. I'm only going to talk about red. But yellow is also showing a bit of a latitudinal gradient. So the latitudinal gradient in red could be driven by just a couple of places that have a lot of red fruits, but we actually find that this pattern is very consistent across continents, both in the northern and the southern hemispheres, although it's a bit weaker in the southern hemisphere. So the big question is, okay, so we feel relatively good that this latitudinal gradient in red is actually real and is replicated across a bunch of different places, and this replication suggests that there's some sort of common mechanism that might be generating this latitudinal gradient. It could be environmental variables, it could have something to do with characteristics of the dispersers, like whether the birds are migratory or not. We don't know that yet, but what we do know is that these patterns are replicated, so we want to try to understand the evolutionary mechanisms behind them. So we have a couple of options. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the first two and kind of ignore all the other ones, and there's many more options as well. But what we're starting to do is look at whether or not higher diversification in red-fruited clades might be driving this pattern. There's actually kind of two ways that this could come into effect. You could have clades that happen to be red that also diversified, or you could actually have red fruit driving diversification. I think it's very unlikely that fruit color is ever going to drive diversification, but it's possible. So we're starting to test whether individual clades are strongly contributing to this pattern. And then we'd also like to look at whether originations of red are stronger at higher latitudes. In other words, this is kind of like a convergence argument, that if you go from this very diverse flora in the tropics to then convergently evolving red at high latitudes, you can also generate this pattern. So we looked at what clades are actually contributing, and the take-home message is that there seem to be a lot of different clades that are contributing, but rosaceae in particular are especially important. And these stars over here indicate the clades that were important in the southern hemisphere, and essentially what we see is that there's different clades that matter in each hemisphere. So the next thing that we wanted to look at is whether red fruit color is associated with colder climatic conditions. We started by looking in viburnum, because that's the group that we know the best, and we have a good phylogeny of it and lots of trait data. And essentially what we find is that fruit color, and red in particular, does seem to correlate with colder climate, although in this case it's really only in one clade. It's really only in this clade down here where you see multiple transitions to red as well as transitions to cold climates. So we're currently in the process of expanding this out and testing other types of climatic conditions to see whether they correlate with fruit color. We looked at a couple different ones in viburnum, and we see that really the only one so far that shows much of a correlation is this minimum temperature of the coldest month. So we then took that variable and what we're doing now is expanding this out and trying to get a bunch of different clades, but currently we have 7. And so trying to look at whether or not fruit color fruit color is correlated with climatic conditions in all of these clades. And interestingly, we actually see that 4 of the clades do show that there's some kind of correlation between fruit color and climate. And this is really interesting and different because the classic idea about fruit colors is that there's this coevolution story between fruits and their animal dispersers, and that animal dispersers are constraining the set of available fruit colors, diversity is being driven by different types of animals, and instead we're actually finding that maybe there's this correlation between climate and fruit color evolution. And that's hopefully, I think it's really interesting because it suggests that maybe this coevolution is not the only mechanism influencing fruit color. So just to recap, we find that the tropics tend to be dominated by fleshy-fruited plants that are dispersed by animals, that these floras are much more diverse in their fruit color, which suggests maybe more diversity in the types of interactions with animals, and that Yeah, and that we see more red fruits, particularly at high latitude. This could be partly driven by certain individual clades like rosaceae, but it also seems to be correlated with the evolution of climatic conditions and that kind of thing in these groups. So fruit color may evolve independently of animal selection, at least under certain circumstances, and we're hoping to expand out on a lot of this work. All right, thank you very much. Yeah.
So if you're seeing this huge increase in red and black fruits, does that mean at higher latitudes we're just losing mammal fruit dispersers?
Yeah, so that's definitely happening. When we look at kind of mammal colors versus bird colors, you see that mammal colors are really only in tropical areas, these classic mammal colors. But yeah, there's a ton of other patterns here that I didn't mention at all, but we do see a lot of spatial patterns.